Hearing will come to order, and I recognize Senator Whitehouse. Thank you, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Chairman. This is my first chance at a committee hearing to congratulate you on taking the gavel here. We worked well together when you were chairman of the Crime and Terrorism Subcommittee, and I hope that that will continue here. Mr. Barr, welcome. Did you make it a condition of taking this job that Rod Rosenstein had to go? Just to be clear, so we're not bandying words here, did you request or signal or otherwise communicate in any way that you wanted Rod Rosenstein to go?
No, the President said that the decision on the deputy was mine. Anything I wanted to do on the deputy was
So
fine.
we will find no William Barr fingerprints on Rosenstein's departure?
No, Rod and I have been talking about his plans. He told me that he viewed it as a 2-year stint and would like to use, if I'm confirmed, my coming in as an occasion to leave. But we talked about the need for a transition, and I asked him if he would stay for a while, and he said he would. And so as of right now, I would say he has no concrete plans. I have no concrete plans in terms of his departure.
And
we're going to sort of play it by ear and see what makes sense.
And you have not undertaken to run him out in any way?
Absolutely not.
That leaves an opening at the DAG position whenever you work this out. Can you tell us, since attorneys general are very often defined by the immediate appointments around them at Chief of Staff, DAG, Criminal Chief, what are the characteristics and qualifications that you will seek as you fill particularly that position, but all three that I mentioned?
I'm sorry, the deputy, and what was the other one?
Deputy Chief of Staff and Criminal Chief.
There is already a criminal chief.
I know.
Yeah.
There's already a Deputy Attorney General, but he's leaving.
Well, for a deputy, I'd like someone who's a really good manager and who has had good management experience running government programs, and I want a first-rate lawyer and someone whose judgment I feel comfortable in.
Experience in the department?
Not necessarily, okay. but experience in government at a high level.
When we met, I gave you a letter that you've seen just so none of these questions would be a surprise, so I hope it is no surprise to you that I'm going through some of them. If you're confirmed, what will be the department's rule regarding communications between White House and Department of Justice officials regarding criminal and investigative matters? Who at DOJ will be allowed to have those conversations with the White House, and who at the White House will you entertain those conversations from at DOJ?
So, I've looked through the existing regime, and my instinct is to keep it, maybe even tighten it up a little bit more. I remember when George W. Bush's administration was coming in, my advice was start tight, and then as you realize who has judgment and so forth, you can go back to a...
They went the other way, and it was a bad day for Attorney General Gonzalez in the hearing room when that was brought to his attention. What is your understanding right now of who at the Department of Justice is authorized to have communications with the White House regarding investigations?
It depends what it is, but on criminal matters, I would just have the AG and the deputy.
And what do you think the rule is now in the department?
I think that's what it is.
Okay. So if the reports are true that, as Chief of Staff, Mr. Whitaker was involved in conversations with the White House about bringing criminal investigations against the president's political enemies, that would not be consistent with your understanding of that policy?
Well, it would depend upon, what his understanding is with the Attorney General.
Well, the Attorney General was recused, so hard to step into the shoes of a recused Attorney General on that matter, right?
Well, I don't know what the communication's related to. I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
Okay. Well, I hope you'll become sure when you get there, because there's a fair amount of, I think, questionable behavior that has gone on that does not reflect well on the department that I hope will get your attention. I I also asked you about the special counsel investigation and to give us a clear exposition of how that memo came to be, who you talked to, when, who was involved in it. There were a number of questions in that letter that at this point you have not answered. You have, I gather, told the chairman the names of some dozen or so people whom you contacted, as I understand it, once the memo was written, but it's not clear. Do you have any objection to answering the questions that I wrote as questions for the record so that the committee can understand who you worked with, who you talked with about this idea, who you worked with in preparing the memo, who helped you with things like citations that people at your level don't often do yourselves, and where it was circulated and vetted and what edits were made and so forth?
No, I have no objection to that.
Great.
But
We'll
just to be clear, no one helped me write the memo, and I know how to do legal citations, which I do.
Yeah, well, a lot of people know how, but that doesn't always do
I do it. I did it. Okay.
You might want to get out of that habit. You may have other things to look at.
I'd like to have some fun in life.
If you think citations are fun, you're not going to have the problem some other nominees have had. My letter to you also asked about the Bork order that set out a series of protections for the then independent counsel operation. Do you have any objection to any of those rules or principles applying, and should we see those rules and principles, which I gave to you then, as being more or less adopted into the statement that you made earlier about your protection of the Mueller investigation from political interference?
You know, I looked at them. I think the current regime is what I'm happy with. In other words, I wouldn't change the current rule. Those rules were put in place at the end of the Clinton administration, and sort of, I think, reflects the back-on-back experience of the Reagan-Bush years and then the Clinton years, and then sort of Justice Department's thinking under the Clinton administration as to how to balance all the equities, and I think it's working well. So,
well, if there's anything that you would disagree with in the so-called Bork rules, I'd ask you to explain that in a follow-up.
Okay. Okay.
Also, in my letter to you, I expressed my concern that Mr. Whitaker was paid $1.2 million through what I consider to be a front group that has very little reality to it, and that the funding that came to that front group to pay him the $1 million came through another entity that is essentially an identity laundering operation that has no independent business operation. And the result of all of this is that somebody out there arranged to get over $1 million to Mr. Whitaker, and we have no idea who that somebody is. And as I mentioned to you in our conversation, I don't see how the department can do a proper recusal and conflict analysis for somebody when the player who delivered the $1 million is still hidden behind the curtain. Is that something that you will help us fix?
Well, first, you know, I don't think there was anything wrong done. Or
well, we don't know that yet because we don't know what the facts are.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying just the facts that you've said, you know, doesn't necessarily mean there was anything wrong done. What you're saying is that if the ultimate financial backers are behind some entity and the current ethics laws require only the reporting of the entity, you're not really sure where the money is coming from. And that, you know, I think that raises a very interesting point that I think I would like to review with the ethics people and experts and even OGE to talk about that, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the trick is going to be deciding what kind of entities and how far back you go, because that can be said of a lot of different kinds of entities.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have first
that if the department's money laundering folks looked at this operation, they would see it as almost amateurish and simple and something quite easy to penetrate, and it would be quite easy simply to ask Mr. Whitaker what he knew, to ask whoever is still at fact, if it even has any existence with Whitaker's departure, what they knew, and to ask Donors Trust to cough up the identity of the donor, and then you can do your homework. And if they refuse to do that, nothing guarantees anybody a job at the highest levels of government who's not willing to provide those disclosures.
Well, as I said, one of my first considerations always is where do you draw the line, and also what are the implications for other kinds of entities? Because, there are membership groups and First Amendment interests, and you don't want to disclose memberships and who's.
And my point was, I think if your money laundering folks took a look at that, they'd be able to help show that this is something that looks a little bit different than that. My time has expired, and see you on the second round. Thank you.
Senator Sass.
I believe Senator Ernst is filling in for Senator Cruz next. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay with me.
Thank you. Mr. Barr, I want to commend you for stepping forward. Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to your family as well for being so supportive in this endeavor. I'm really pleased to have all of you here, so thank you for doing that. Mr. Barr, later this month, I do plan on reintroducing Sarah's Law, which is a bill that would require the detention of illegal aliens who have been charged with a crime that resulted in the death or serious injury, bodily injury of another person. Now that sounds pretty common sense, but I'll give you a little background. This bill is named after Sarah Root. She was a resident of Council Bluffs, Iowa, and Sarah was killed by an illegal alien who was driving drunk. And that alien had a blood alcohol content of more than 3 times the legal limit, yet he was allowed to post bond and has not been seen since. It's important to me that Congress act to close these loopholes in our immigration system and do better to enforce the laws that are already existing on the books. And I know that Attorney General Sessions, he had a real passion for this, and he had a strong record of trying to make sure that we're correcting wrongs in the system. How do you, as Attorney General, plan on making sure that we are restoring the rule of law in our immigration system?
Well, first, that sounds like a very commonsensical bill and something that I would certainly be inclined to support. I think one of our major problems, as the President says, is that the immigration laws just have to be changed and to provide sensible and common sense ways of processing immigration and claims of asylum. Right now, this goes all the way. This goes back 27 years. We were facing exactly the same kind of problem, maybe on a smaller scale. But Congress has to, where people are abusing the asylum system, coming in, they're being coached as to what to say, and then once they come in, we don't have the facilities to keep them, and they're released into the population. And this was a big abuse, as I say, 27 years ago, and it's gotten worse. So we need to change the laws to stop that kind of abuse and enable us to run a lawful immigration system where we process people into the country who are entitled to come into the country, and we keep out those that are flouting our laws. And it's long overdue. And the President is right that until we're able to do that, we're just not going to be able to get control over illegal immigration, and it creates a lot of unsafe conditions for many people.
Absolutely, and I appreciate your thoughts on that. This is a very important issue. I think all of us understand that immigration is so vital to our country, but it has to be done in the right manner. And for those that are causing bodily injury and death to those here in the United States, we want to make sure that they are brought to justice. And in this case, that illegal, undocumented was not brought to justice. And I feel a lot of empathy for that family. I'll move into another situation that's really important to Iowans. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, after drug dealing, human trafficking is tied with arms dealing as the second largest criminal industry in the world, and it generates about $32 billion each year. The Department of Justice has said that 83% of sex trafficking victims identified in the United States are U.S. citizens, with the average age of a victim being between 12 and 14 years. 12 and 14 years. Since 2007, there have been over 300 cases of human trafficking in Iowa alone. And Iowa is a very rural state. 300 cases. That's very concerning to my constituents back home. What do you see as the main contributor to human trafficking here in the United States? And then how can the DOJ impact and combat and prevent those heinous crimes?
This is an area that, frankly, wasn't very much on the radar scope of the Department of Justice when I was last there. I know it's it's an abhorrent area of criminality that I know the department and Attorney General Sessions have been focused on, and have put in place various programs and entities within the department to focus on it and work with state and local law enforcement on it. I'm not sure what the major contributor to it is. It's an area that I'm going to have to study when I get into the department and see what are the factors contributing to it.
Okay, I appreciate that. And as I mentioned in my question as well, drugs and drug trafficking, that is also a very, very big industry. And in fiscal year 2017, 65% of drug-related prison sentences in Iowa were related to methamphetamine. We talk a lot about the opioid crisis, but in Iowa, it still is meth. Mm-hmm. In 2016, Iowa reported over 1,500 founded child abuse reports relating to methamphetamine being found in the child's body. According to the DEA, most of the meth available in the United States is being produced in Mexico and smuggled across our southern border. How do you see the situation at our southern border contributing to the prevalence of controlled substance use here in the United States?
Well, as been pointed out earlier, it is the major avenue by which drugs come into the country. Heroin, fentanyl, all the serious drugs are coming across that border. And again, I feel it is a critical part of border security that we need to have barriers on the border. We need a barrier system on the border to get control over the border. And I think obviously there's some places that more of the traffic comes over than others, but unless you have a system across the border, you're not going to be able to deal with it because you'll just displace it. If you build a barrier in one place, you'll just displace it to another. So we need a barrier system across the border. Part of that is illegal immigration, but a big part of it also is preventing the influx of drugs. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And you stated earlier that really the head of the snake lies outside of the United States. Is there a way that DOJ can be working with additional ideas, methodology with other departments that you might think would help?
Yes, this is an area, again, because I'm out of the government, I don't know how it's functioning, how the drug war is being coordinated, but I think justice can play a big role in pushing for partners like the State Department, Defense Department, the intelligence agencies, and so forth to help deal with this. It's not, to me, not just a law enforcement problem, it's a national security problem. Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned as well the situation on the border where we do need barriers in place to control the influx of whether it's drugs, human trafficking, gun trafficking, so forth. Do you believe that sanctuary cities play a role in harboring some of those activities?
Yes, I do. I think there are a number of sort of, of factors that have a hydraulic effect in that they pull people into the United States or induce them to make take the hazards of coming into the United States and coming up hundreds of miles through Mexico and so forth. And things like sanctuary cities where they feel that they'll be able to come up and hide and be protected is one of those factors that I think is irresponsible because it attracts the illegal aliens coming in. Obviously, I think that the main problem with sanctuary cities is that they're not giving us information about criminals that they have in their custody. This is not chasing after, families or anything like that. This is going after criminals who the state local law enforcement have in custody, and not allowing us to take custody of them and get them out of the country. That's the problem with sanctuary cities.
Correct, which could be the situation with Edwin Mejia, who killed Sarah Root. So we would love to see that young man brought to justice. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Well, just follow up on that, Senator Klobuchar. Don't count this against her time. So you're saying that you want access to people who've committed crimes or accused of committing crimes outside of a status violation. Is that what?
That's right, Senator.
Okay. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barr. I take it as a positive that your grandson has gotten out a pen and a pad of paper to take notes during my questions. I am also impressed by your daughters and that they all chose to go into public service. But as you know, employees at the Justice Department now are either furloughed or they are working without pay. And I have talked to a number of them at home, and it's an outrage. Very briefly, what do you have to say to them?
I would like to see a deal reached whereby Congress recognizes that it's imperative to have border security, and that part of that border security, as a common sense matter, needs barriers.
And you're aware that in the comprehensive Senate immigration bill that we passed, there was literally billions of dollars for border security back in 2013?
I'm generally aware of that.
And that also we had an agreement earlier last year which would allow the Dreamers to stay legally that also had money for border security?
The point is we need money right now for border security,
yes, well,
including barriers and walls and slats and other things, anything that makes sense in different areas of the border.
Okay, in different areas. That's a good point. So President George H.W. Bush said back in 1980 that he didn't want to see 6- and 8-year-old kids being made to feel that they're living outside the law, and you were his Attorney General. He also said that immigration is not just a link to America's past, but it's a bridge to America's future. Do you agree with those statements?
Yes, I think, as I said, I think legal immigration has, we have a great system potential. I think it needs reforming, but legal immigration has been good for the United States. Okay. It's been great for the country.
And that's why we were trying to work on that comprehensive reform. I want to just briefly turn to FBI leadership. The President has made statements accusing the FBI of making politically motivated decisions. Many of us up here and in the Senate have confidence in Director Wray and the leadership at the FBI and believe they can do their jobs without politics getting in the way. Do you agree with that?
I'm looking, if I'm confirmed, I'm looking forward to getting to know Chris Wray. From what I know, I think very highly of him.
Okay, thank you. In the memo from back in June, the one comment that Senator Grassley made, he talked about how much the Mueller investigation was costing, and I actually did a little Googling here, and there was a CNBC report that it actually could bring in more money than it cost because of the wealthy people being prosecuted, that Manafort's assets could be well over $40 million. I don't know if that includes that ostrich jacket, but Do you think that's possible based on your experience with white-collar crime?
I don't know enough about it.
Okay. In your memo, you talked about the Comey decision, and you talked about obstruction of justice, and you already went over that, which I appreciate. You wrote on page 1 that a president persuading a person to commit perjury would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Or any person who persuades another to, yeah.
Okay. You also said that a president or any person convincing a witness to change testimony would be obstruction. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And on page 2, you said that a president deliberately impairing the integrity or availability of evidence would be an obstruction. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so what if a president told a witness not to cooperate with an investigation or hinted at a pardon?
You know, I'd have to know the specific. I'd have to know the specific facts.
Okay. And you wrote on page 1 that if a president knowingly destroys or alters evidence, that would be obstruction.
Yes.
Okay. So what if a president drafted a misleading statement to conceal the purpose of a meeting? Would that be obstruction?
Again, you know, I'd have to know the specifics.
All right. You would seek the advice of career ethics officials in the Department of Justice for any recusal, and I appreciate that. And you said in the past that you commended Attorney General Sessions for following the advice of those ethics lawyers, but you didn't commit today to following that advice. Is that right?
No, I didn't commend him for following the advice. As the agency head, he's the one responsible for making the recusal decision. I don't know why he locked himself into following the advice. That's an abdication of his own responsibility.
So what did you think about what Acting Attorney General Whitaker did when he rejected the Justice Department ethics advice to recuse himself out of an abundance of caution?
I haven't seen the advice he got, and I don't know the specific facts. But abundance of caution suggests that it could have gone either way.
You've committed to recuse yourself from matters involving the law firm where you currently work. Are you aware of any of your firm's clients who are in any way connected to the special counsel's investigation?
I'm not aware. To tell you the truth, I'm of counsel there, and I have one client which I'm representing, and I don't pay very much attention to.
Well, you can also supplement that.
Yeah, I'll supplement my
answer. No
answer.
problem. Will you commit to make public all of the report's conclusions, the Mueller report, even if some of the evidence supporting those conclusions can't be made public?
You know, that certainly is my goal and intent. It's hard for me to conceive of a conclusion that would run afoul of the regs as currently written, but that's certainly my intent.
Secure elections, you and I had a talk about that in my office. Do you think backup paper ballots are a good idea? This is a bill that Senator Langford and I have introduced, and with Senator Graham and Senator Harris.
Yeah, I don't know what's a good idea, what's a bad idea right now, because I haven't gotten into this area, but...
Okay, well, I'll just tell you backup paper ballots is a good idea.
Okay.
And we can talk about it later, as well as audits along the lines of voting. State election officials in North Carolina, as you know, contacted the Justice Department about the integrity of their elections. The Justice Department may have failed to take action in a timely manner. What steps would you take to make sure these failures don't occur again?
Not specifically with respect to North Carolina, you're talking generally. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as I say, I want to make one of my priorities the integrity of elections, and so this is not an area I have been involved with deeply before, and when I get to the department, if I'm confirmed, I'm going to start working with the people and making sure that those kinds of things don't happen.
Part of this, of course, is also voting rights and our concern about some of the changes in department policy, and I hope you will seriously look at that, because the last thing we should be doing is suppressing voting, and that is what we've been seeing under this current administration. My dad was a reporter, so I grew up knowing the importance of a free press. We obviously have the tragic case of a journalist who worked right here at the Washington Post, Jamal Khashoggi, and it's a particular concern. So I want to ask you something I asked Attorney General Sessions. If you're confirmed, will the Justice Department jail reporters for doing their jobs?
I think that, you know, I know there are guidelines in place, and I can conceive of situations where, you know, as a last resort, and where a news organization has run through a red flag or something like that, knows that they're putting out stuff that will hurt the country. There might be there could be a situation where someone would be held in contempt, but
well, Attorney General Sessions had said he was going to look at potentially changing those rules at one point. So I'd like you to maybe respond in writing to this, because that was very concerning. And when you and I were in my office, we talked about your work with Time Warner with this major merger on appeal from the Justice Department, and I just wanted you to commit today to what you committed to me in the office, that you would recuse yourself from any matters regarding that appeal.
absolutely.
Okay. And as you know, you were on the board of Time Warner at the time, and you signed a sworn affidavit questioning whether the Justice Department's decision to block the merger was politically motivated, given, and this is from the affidavit, the President's prior public animus towards the merger. Are you talking here about his view on CNN? What did you mean by prior public animus?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure.
Yeah.
You were on the board of Time Warner, and you signed a sworn affidavit questioning whether the Justice Department's decision to block the merger was politically motivated, given the President's prior public animus toward the merger. And so what did you mean by that?
I mean, the affidavit speaks for itself in that at that meeting, I was concerned that the antitrust division was not engaging with some of our arguments, and I got concerned that they weren't taking the merits as seriously as I would hope they would. But I have, you know, I have no, I'm not sure why they acted the way they did.
Okay, very good. And I'll ask you more on antitrust policy-wise in the second round, and I appreciated the discussion we had on that. It's very important. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you. Senator Hawley did a good thing by allowing Senator Ernst to go, because she had no good deed goes unpunished around here, but you do have a credit with the chairman, so I appreciate that. Senator Cruz, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Hawley, as well, and welcome to the committee. Welcome to all the new members of the committee, and congratulations, Mr. Chairman. We are looking forward to the Lindsey Graham chairmanship of Judiciary, and I'm sure if...
They'll make a movie about it, I'm sure.
I am certain whatever else happens, it will not be boring. Welcome, Mr. Barr. Congratulations on your nomination yet again. And let me say thank you. You and I have visited before about this, but the past 2 years have been a difficult time at the Department of Justice. And you and I and many on this committee hold the Justice Department in very high esteem. Indeed, I would even say revere the department and its century-long tradition of enforcing the law without regard to party and without regard to partisanship. And I commend you for your willingness to go back and serve once again. I think that is a good step for the department and a good step for strengthening the department. You know, I would note 27 years ago, when you did this previously, when you were last nominated to be Attorney General, when I think you may have been about Liam's age at the time, it was a different time. Then Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Joe Biden, said at the time that he found you to be, quote, honest, and that you, quote, understand and are committed to the dual responsibility of the Office of the Attorney General. Chairman Biden also said that, quote, this commitment to the public interest above all else is a critical attribute in an Attorney General, and I will vote to confirm Mr. Barr. Senator Ted Kennedy likewise noted your dedication to public service. Senator Fritz Hollings said, quote, Mr. Barr has a distinguished academic background and impressive experience in private sector as well as in public service. Most important, Bill Barr is a known quantity. He has done a truly outstanding job as Deputy Attorney General for the last year and a half, during which time he has worked with many of us in this body, earning our respect for his professionalism and competence. And Senator Cole said that, quote, your willingness to discuss the issues is a refreshing change in the confirmation process, and it would be wise of future nominees to follow Mr. Barr's example. At that hearing, you were confirmed by this committee unanimously, as you had been twice previously for senior appointments to the Department of Justice. Now, we all recognize that was a different time. I think given the environment we are in now, few expect this committee vote to be unanimous. But I would hope those voices from the past, from Democrats who were respected by members of this committee, will be heard today as well. One of the questions you were asked, if I might paraphrase, was, why on earth would you take this job? And your answer, if I recall correctly, concerned your commitment both to the department and the rule of law. Would you tell this committee, in your judgment, why the rule of law matters? Why is that important?
Well, you know, as our framers said in the Federalist Papers, the art of setting up a government is to have a government that's strong enough to perform the functions that a government has to perform, while at the same time not being so strong that it can oppress its own people. And the rule of law ensures that precisely that the government does not oppress its own people. And when people are accused of wrongdoing, our system essentially gives them the benefit of the doubt and gives them rights to bring them up essentially to the same level as the government. And the process we go through is there to ensure that justice is not arbitrary, but it's done according to a set of rules. And the basic protection that we have is that the rule that applies to one applies to all. That, at the end of the day, is what keeps us all free. That is the protection of individual freedom. And to me, the rule of law is exactly that, that we don't allow special rules to go into effect for a particular individual. A rule has to be universalized. Anything we do against A has to be universalized across everyone who's similarly situated. That's our basic protection, and to me, that's what the rule of law is.
So I don't want to see a Republican Department of Justice or a Democratic Department of Justice. I don't want to see a Republican FBI or a Democratic FBI. What we should see, what the American people have a right to see and a right to expect, is a Department of Justice that is committed to and faithful to the Constitution and the laws, regardless of political party. And a corollary to that is a department that is willing to hold anyone who commits criminal conduct accountable, regardless of that individual's political party or whatever partisan interest there might be. Would you agree with that characterization?
Senator. Yes, Senator.
I would note as well, during the previous administration, there was concern by many, including me on this committee, that the previous administration, and in particular the IRS, had targeted individual citizens and citizen groups for exercising their First Amendment rights and had abused its power in doing so. The current Justice Department, I've been dissatisfied with the degree of scrutiny they have given to that potential abuse of power. And I'm going to ask you going forward, if you are confirmed, to examine that conduct and ensure that if laws were broken, that individuals are held accountable. Let me shift to a different topic. One of the most important safeguards of our liberties is the Bill of Rights. And the Attorney General has a unique responsibility defending the Constitution. Can you share for this committee, in your view, the importance of free speech, of the protections that the First Amendment provides to Americans to speak, and even to speak on unpopular or politically disfavored topics?
I think free speech is at the core of our system because we believe in the democratic process and power shifting through the processes of voting by an informed electorate. And free speech is foundational to the ability to have a democratic process. The framers, I think, believe that the dialectic, the clashing of ideas in the public marketplace, is the way to arrive at the truth. And that is one function. Another function of free speech is that it's the substitute for other means of settling differences. In some ways, it's a safety valve. People are allowed to speak their mind and persuade their neighbors of their position. And I think that performs a very important function in keeping the peace within a community. And if speech is suppressed, it can lead to the building up of pressures within society that sometimes can be explosive.
How about your views on religious liberty? And would you share your thoughts on the importance of the religious liberty protections in the First Amendment in terms of protecting our diverse and pluralistic society?
Yes, I think the framers believe that our system, they said that our system only works if the people are in a position to control themselves. Our government is an experiment in how much freedom we can allow the people without tearing ourselves apart. And they believed fewer laws, more self-control, and they believed that part of that self-control, and I know there are many people here who disagree, in our society, not here, but in our society who disagree, but they believe part of that self-control ultimately came from religious values. And I think it's important underpinning of our system that we permit, I believe in the separation of church and state, but I am sometimes concerned that we not use governmental power to suppress the freedoms of traditional religious communities in our country.
Final question. The Department of Justice is charged with defending the United States, but that doesn't mean that the Department of Justice always must argue for maximum federal power. There are important restraints on federal power, whether civil liberties protections in a criminal context, whether the Takings Clause, or whether the 10th Amendment and federalism. Can you briefly share your thoughts on the appropriate balance of respecting the limitations on federal power?
Well, as you say, the Constitution has many different forms of restraint on federal power. Part of it is, in fact, the separation of powers within the federal government. Part of it is the balance between the federalist system we have and the central government, and respecting the rights of the states and local communities. And part of it is the Bill of Rights that on certain topics constrains the role of the federal government. And those are all important checks on federal power. And, I am concerned about our country becoming just a unitary state that we try to govern centrally, 350 million people. I think a lot of our current tensions in society are because we are turning our back on the federalist model. There are certain things that have to be protected by the federal government. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But the more we can decentralize decision-making, the more we can allow people a real diversity in the country of approaches to things, I think we'll have less of an explosive situation.
I very much agree. Thank you, Mr. Barr.
The freedom of speech has to be balanced by the freedom to question. Senator Coons.
Congratulations, Chairman Graham. I look forward to working with you in this Congress. And thank you, Mr. Barr, and to you and your family for their service to our country through federal law enforcement and the Department of Justice. You just faced some questioning from Senator Cruz about your own confirmation hearing back in 1991, and I'd like to take us back to a previous confirmation hearing, which was at a more similar time to today than 1991, 1973. Senator Leahy asked you about the confirmation of Elliot Richardson, President Nixon's nominee to be Attorney General. That confirmation took place in the context of a similarly divided period in American history where there was great concern over the, at that point, ongoing Watergate investigation. And Elliot Richardson reassured the country by making some important commitments during his confirmation hearing before this committee. Then Senator Strom Thurmond asked Richardson if he wanted a special prosecutor who would, and I quote, shield no one and prosecute this case regardless of who was affected in any way, shape, or form. Richardson responded, exactly. Do you want Special Counsel Mueller to shield no one and prosecute the case regardless of who is affected?
I want Special Counsel Mueller to discharge his responsibilities as a federal prosecutor and exercise the judgment that he's expected to exercise under the rules and finish his job.
Senator Kennedy followed up by asking Richardson if the special prosecutor would have the complete authority and responsibility for determining whom he prosecuted and at what location. Richardson said simply, yes. Would you give a similar answer?
No, I would give the answer that's in the current regulations, which is that the special counsel has, broad discretion, but the acting attorney general in this case, Rod Rosenstein, can ask them about major decisions, and if they disagree on a major decision, and if after giving great weight to the special counsel's position, the acting attorney general felt that it was so unwarranted under established policies that it should not be followed, then that would be reported to this committee.
Forgive me, I've got 7 minutes left. I have a number of other questions. Let me just make sure I understand you. Senators asked Elliot Richardson what he would do if he disagreed with the special prosecutor. Richardson testified to the committee the special prosecutor's judgment would prevail. That's not what you're saying. You're saying that if you have a difference of opinion with Special Counsel Mueller, you won't necessarily back his decision. You might overrule it.
Under the regulations, there is the possibility of that, but this committee would not, would be aware of it. A lot of water has gone under the dam since Elliot Richardson, and a lot of different administrations on both parties have experimented with special counsel arrangements.
Well,
and the existing rules, I think, reflect the experience of both Republican and Democratic administrations and strike the right balance. They are put together in the Clinton administration after Ken Starr's investigation.
That's right. So the current regulations on the books right now prevent the Attorney General from firing without cause the special counsel. They require misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict. Will you follow that standard?
Of course.
What if the president asked you to rescind or change those special counsel regulations?
I think those special counsel regulations should stay in place for the duration of this investigation, and we can do a postmortem then, but I have no reason to think they're not working.
So most famously, when directed by President Nixon to fire the special counsel, the prosecutor investigating Watergate. Richardson refused and resigned instead, as we all well know. If the president directed you to change those regulations and then fire Mueller, or simply directly fired Mueller, would you follow Richardson's example and resign instead?
Assuming there was no good cause?
Assuming no good cause.
I would not carry out that instruction.
Let me bring us forward to your 1991 hearing in front of this committee. You explained at the time how you would handle the BCCI case, and ironically, Robert Mueller, the same individual, was at that point the head of the criminal division. And you testified that you had directed Mueller to spare no resources, use whatever resources are necessary, and pursue the investigation as aggressively as possible and follow the evidence anywhere and everywhere it leads. Would you give similar direction to Robert Mueller today?
I don't think he needs that direction. I think that's what he's doing.
You also said at that hearing that Robert Mueller in that investigation had full cooperation, full support, and carte blanche. Could he expect a similar level of support from you as Attorney General?
Yeah, he will. As I said, I'm going to carry out those regulations, and I want him to finish this investigation.
I think we all do. And I am encouraged by things you've said about this and just want to make sure we've had as clear a conversation as we can. Attorney General Richardson also testified the relationship between the President and the Justice Department should be arm's length. You've said similar things about the importance of shielding the department from political influence. Can you make a similar commitment to us to maintain an arm's length relationship between the Justice Department and the President regarding the Special Counsel investigation and other investigations?
Yeah, well, remember I said that there are like 3 different functions generally that the Attorney General performs. I think on the enforcement side, especially where matters are of either personal or political interest to people at the White House, then there has to be an arm's length relationship. The White House counsel can play a constructive role in that as well.
Let me ask, if the President asked for information that could well be used to interfere with the special counsel investigation, to misdirect or curtail it in some way, would you give it to him?
No, I mean, there are rules on what kind of information can flow and what kind of communications can go between the White House, and I would follow those. But the basic principle is that the integrity of an investigation has to be protected. There are times where you can share information that wouldn't threaten the integrity of an investigation, like, for example, when I was Attorney General and we were investigating something that related to President, someone who had a relationship with President Bush, I could just orient them that, there's going to be a story tomorrow that, says this, but in that particular case, there was no chance that it would affect the investigation. So sometimes judgment calls are necessary.
If you learn that the White House, not directly through you, but through other means, was attempting to interfere with the investigation, would you report that information to the special counsel and to Congress?
Well, there's some conclusions in there about interfering, and if I thought something improper was being done, then I would deal with it as Attorney General.
Last, in that confirmation hearing back in 1973, then Senator Birchby of Indiana asked Richardson, suppose the prosecutor determines it's necessary to get the president's affidavit or to have his testimony personally. Would that be the kind of determination he, the special prosecutor, could make? Richardson said, yes. Will you give a similar answer today that you won't interfere with Special Counsel Mueller seeking testimony from the president?
I think, as I say, the regulations currently provide some avenue if there's some disagreement. I think that in order to overrule Mueller, someone would have to the Attorney General or the acting Attorney General would have to determine, after giving Mueller's position great weight, that it was so unwarranted under established policies that it should not be done. So that's the standard I would apply. But I'm not going to surrender the regulations give some responsibility to the Attorney General to have this sort of general not day-to-day supervision, but sort of be there in case something really transcends the established policies. I'm not surrendering that responsibility. I'm not pledging it away.
What gives me pause and sort of led me to this line of questioning, Mr. Barr, was that June 2018 memo you sent to the Deputy Attorney General, in which at one point you state Mueller should not be permitted to demand the President submit to interrogation about alleged obstruction. If the special counsel wants to subpoena the President's testimony to ask questions about obstruction, and you're supervising the investigation, would you rely on that theory to block the subpoena?
Well, the question for me would be, what's the predicate? And I don't know what the facts are. I don't know what the facts are. And if there was a factual basis for doing it, and I couldn't say that it violated established policies, then I wouldn't interfere. But I don't know what the facts are.
Well, if I might, just in closing, Mr. Chairman, we're in this unique situation where you've known Robert Mueller 30 years. You've said you respect and admire his professionalism, his conduct. He's been entrusted by you with a significant, complex investigations in the past. There's no reason to imagine, since he is the person who would know the facts, that he wouldn't be acting in an inappropriate way. So it is my hope, even my expectation, that you would trust Robert Mueller to make that decision about whether to compel the President to testify in an appropriate way and that he would not face any interference. Thank you for your testimony today. I look forward to a next round.
Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your new calling here. Liam, I have career advice. I won't do it on camera. We want to know if you're taking notes for your cousins about career advice, though. We'll ask you later. General, congratulations on your nomination, and thanks for your past service. I had planned to ask you for some pledges related to the Mueller investigation in private to me, in public today. I think you've already done that. How should the American people think about what the Mueller investigation is about?
I think that there were allegations made of Russian attempts to interfere in the election, and there were allegations made that some Americans were in cahoots with the Russians, and the word is now that's being used is collusion. And as I understand it, Mueller is looking into those allegations.
You know, a lot of the media summary of the investigation starts with people's views and who they voted for in the 2016 presidential election. And for those of us who spend a lot of time reading intelligence reports, a handful of us on this committee are about to leave to go to an intelligence briefing. What Russia is doing to the U.S. is big and broad and not constrained to the 2016 election. And increasingly, it feels like the American people reduce Russia to just how you thought about the 2016 presidential election. So since you'll have serious supervisory responsibilities over parts of the intelligence community, is Putin a friend or a foe, and what are his long-term objectives toward the U.S.?
Well, I don't hold myself out as a foreign policy expert, but I think that he is. I think the Russians are a potent rival of our country, and his foreign policy objectives are usually directly contrary to our goals. I think he wants to weaken the American alliances in Europe, and he also wants to become a player in the Middle East, more of a player in the Middle East. A lot of his foreign policy objectives are at odds with ours. At the same time, I think the primary rival of the United States is China. I think, Russia is half the size it was when we were facing them at the peak of the Cold War. Their economy is long-term prognosis is nowhere near China's. I also feel that part of what Russia's up to is trying to hold on to Ukraine and Belarus in their orbit. But I'm concerned that the fixation on Russia not obscure the danger from China.
I want to ask you some China questions as well. I want to ask about your role on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, but sticking with Russia for a minute. Does Putin have any long-term ideological alignment with the U.S., or does he have other objectives trying to sow discord broadly here?
You know, I'm not an expert on this area, but I think there are, I think there may be some potential areas where our interests could be aligned.
But when he interferes here, does he have long-term interests in the success of one or another political party, or does he have specific interests in sowing chaos and discord to make Americans distrust one another? And one of the reasons I ask is because I'd love to have you say in public some of what you said to me about at the end of this investigation, what happens next? Are you concerned that when the Mueller report is received, quite apart from the narrowest pieces, you know where I'm headed?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the basic vulnerability of the United States in the age in which we live, the internet age, the globalization of information and so forth, is the vulnerability of that we're seeing, which is people can create doubt, undercut confidence in our election process, and also torque our public discourse in ways that we find hard to perceive. And this has long-term danger for the United States and the survival of a democratic society like ours. And so I hope that whatever the outcome of the Mueller investigation, that we view this as a bigger problem of foreign interference in our elections, which is why I said it was one of my priorities. And it's not just the Russians, it's other countries as well. And we have to focus on that. We have to ensure that we're doing all we can. And I'm not sure all of that is defensive either. I mean, in terms of law enforcement, I think we have to look at all options, including sanctions and other options to deter organized efforts to interfere in our elections.
So you have no reason to doubt any aspect of the intelligence community's composite assessment about Russian efforts in the 2016 election?
I have no reason to doubt that the Russians attempted to interfere in our election.
And Dan Coates, the National Intelligence Director, has testified in public and has said in different media contexts that Russia is already plotting for the 2020 elections in the U.S. You have no reason to doubt that.
I haven't, I haven't seen those reports. I had reviewed the reports about the 2016, but I have no reason to doubt it.
And can you explain what your role is on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board?
Yeah, I'm actually a consultant. I'm an advisor on sort of legal issues. Obviously, I'm stepping down from that position if I'm confirmed, but I've been just advising. I'm not a member of the board. I'm on the CIA's External Advisory Board, and have been participating on that as well.
When you talk about the long-term Chinese efforts to also sow different kinds of discord in the U.S., obviously not crossing any classified lines here, but long-term interests that other countries have in strategic rivalry with the U.S. to use gray space and information operations warfare against us. How do you see the role of the National Security Branch and the FBI more broadly fitting into the larger IC, and what responsibilities do you see would be on your priority list as you arrive at the department?
Well, I've been out of the department for so long. I'm not really sure about how that is currently being handled. I also think that we've had our attention focused on terrorism, which we can't let up, and but I want to make sure that, and I'm sure Chris Wray is on top of this, and looking forward to talking to him about it, of making sure that the Bureau is playing a central role in combating efforts by foreign countries to engage in those kinds of hostile intelligence activities.
You have unpacked a couple of times today the three different roles or functions of the Attorney General. Could you do that one more time in summary? And then I want to ask you a particular question. What are those three roles as you see them?
I see the three roles. In 1789, the first to set up the office, the first role was providing advice to the President and the Cabinet and representing the United States in cases before the Supreme Court. And I see the three roles as providing advice, being a policy advisor on legal and law enforcement policy issues, and the top law enforcement officer enforcing the laws.
And so in no way would the job of protecting the president be a subset of any of those three jobs? The language of protecting the president has been used occasionally in this administration to refer to the way it was conceived of how Eric Holder did his job. Is there any sense in which it's the Attorney General's job to protect the president?
No, that wasn't included in my description of the role of the Attorney General. Obviously, as in the policy arena, the Attorney General is someone who should be sympathetic to the administration and its policy goals.
But there are circumstances where those three roles could come into some internal conflict, or you could be asked to do things that don't align with them. And there's probably a list that you have. I want to ask you to enumerate it here. But there's probably a list of issues where you could imagine needing to resign because of what you were asked to do in the space of so-called protecting the president.
If I was ever asked to do something that I thought was unlawful and directed to do that, I wouldn't do it, and I would resign rather than do it. But I think that should be true of every officer who serves anywhere in government, whatever branch.
I am at time, but I had a series of questions related to some of what Senator Ernst did about Sarah's Law. She and I have jointly been active in that space. The tragic case of the young woman that she was talking about from Council Bluffs it occurred in Omaha, and Edwin Mejia, her killer, is still at large, and both the last administration and this administration have not prioritized that enough in our understanding, and I imagine that Senator Ernst and I will follow up with a letter to you on that as well. Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate you, and I look forward to working with you, and congratulate also the new members of our committee that have joined us, and thank you very much, Mr. Barr, for being here today, for your past record of public service, and I hope I am perhaps the last to make reference to your grandson by saying that if he makes it through this hearing today, he can have any job he wants in this building. Let me say first that as a former United States Attorney, I share your allegiance and admiration for the Department of Justice, and equally so, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I know that you respect Mr. Wray, the current director, but I think you would agree with me that the FBI is probably one of the best, if not the most professional, accomplished, skilled, and dedicated law enforcement agencies in the world. Would you agree?
Yes, Senator.
And I hope that the President agrees with you and perhaps shares that view more publicly in the future. When the FBI begins a counterintelligence investigation, if it is of the President of the United States for working with a foreign adversary, that decision would be subject to multiple levels of review within the FBI, correct?
I assume. I don't know what rules were in effect at the time.
Well, in your experience,
yes,
there would be.
Yes. And
you have no reason to think that those rules have changed.
I don't know what the practice was. There was,
and almost certainly in that kind of extraordinary investigation, you would agree with me, it would be extraordinary for the FBI to be investigating the President for working with a determined foreign adversary. There probably would be information shared with the Deputy Attorney General or the Attorney General. Agreed?
I would hope so. the reason I'm hesitating is because, some of these texts that we've all read are so weird and beyond my experience with the FBI. I don't know what was going on.
Well, these reports are stomach-churning in terms of the absolutely stunning and unprecedented kind of investigation that they reflect. You'd agree?
You mean the texts are stomach-turning?
The reports of the investigation of the president.
I'm not sure what you're talking about when you say the reports of the investigation.
The reports that the FBI opened an investigation of the president for working with a foreign adversary, Russia.
And what's stomach-churning about that? What is stomach-churning? The allegation against the president, or the fact that
that kind of allegation would be made and be under investigation? Well, let me move on. Yeah. I want to talk about transparency. Will you commit to this committee that you will not allow the president or his attorneys to edit or change the special counsel report before it is submitted to Congress or the public?
I already said that I would not permit editing of my report, whatever report I or whoever is the Attorney General makes.
And will you commit that you will come to Congress and explain any deletions or changes that are made to that report before it is issued? Okay,
so there are different reports at work here. Which report are you? There are two different reports.
The Special Counsel report.
Okay, well, under the current regulations, the Special Counsel report is confidential. And the report that goes public would be a report by the Attorney General.
Will you commit that you will explain to us any changes or deletions that you make to the Special Counsel report that's submitted to you in whatever you present to us?
I will commit to providing as much information as I can consistent with the regulations. Are you saying, for example, that if information is deleted, that would be like for classification purposes, I would identify that and things like that?
Well, that you will commit to explaining to us what the reasons are for your deleting any information that the Special Counsel includes that you are preventing us or the public from seeing.
That would be my intent. I have to say that the rules, I don't know what kind of report is being prepared. I have no idea. And I have no idea what Acting Attorney General Rosenstein has discussed with Special Counsel Mueller. If I'm confirmed, I'm going to go in and see what's being contemplated and what they've agreed to and what their interpretation, what game plan they have in mind.
Will you permit
but my purpose is to get as much accurate information out as I can consistent with the regulations.
Well, the regulations and rules give you extraordinarily broad discretion. And I'm hoping, and I'm asking you to commit, that you will explain to us information that you have taken out of that Special Counsel report. And I also want to ask you about restrictions on the Special Counsel. Will you commit that you will allow the Special Counsel to exercise his judgment on subpoenas that are issued and indictments that he may decide should be brought?
As I said, I will carry out my responsibilities under the regulations. Under the regulations, whoever is Attorney General can only overrule the Special Counsel if the Special Counsel does something that is so unwarranted under established practice. I am not going to surrender the responsibilities I have. You would not like it if I made some pledge to the President that I was going to exercise my responsibilities in a particular way, and I'm not going to make a pledge to anyone on this committee that I'm going to exercise it in a particular way or surrender it.
Will you allow the Special Counsel to exercise his judgment as to what resources are necessary? Will you meet those needs for resources?
That would be my expectation. I think, I mean, if you believe the media, they're sort of starting to reduce their resources, so I wouldn't expect that would be a problem.
Will you allow the special counsel to exercise his judgment as to what the scope should be? The president has talked about red lines around finances. Will you allow the special counsel to exercise his judgment about what the scope should be, even if the president says that there should be red lines?
I think the scope of the investigation is determined by his charter from the acting attorney general. And if he wants to go beyond that charter, I assume he would come back and talk to whoever the attorney general is about.
Will you impose any restrictions on other prosecutors who are also investigating the president? As you're well aware, in the Southern District of New York, the president has been named, in effect, as an unindicted co-conspirator. The Eastern District of Virginia has an investigation that's relevant to the president. Will you impose any restrictions on those prosecutors?
The Office of Attorney General is in charge of the with the exception of the special counsel who has special rules applicable to him, is in charge of the work of the Department of Justice.
But you have a responsibility to allow prosecutors to enforce the law.
I have the responsibility to use my judgment and discretion that are inherent in the Office of Attorney General to supervise. And I'm not going to go around saying, well, this U.S. attorney or that U.S. attorney I'm going to defer to.
Well, you referred earlier to the possibility of firing a United States attorney. Would you allow the president to fire a United States attorney and thereby stop an investigation?
I would not stand by and allow a U.S. attorney to be fired for the purpose of stopping an investigation, but the president can fire a U.S. attorney. They're a presidential appointment.
But the president should have a cause beyond simply stopping an investigation for firing a United States attorney, even if he or she is a political.
Well, as I said, I would not stand by and allow an investigation to be stopped if I thought it was a lawful investigation. I wouldn't stand by for that. But the president is free to fire his officials that he's appointed.
I want to ask a question on a different topic. You said that, and I'm quoting you, I believe Roe v. Wade should be overruled. You said that in 1991. Do you still believe it?
I said in 1991 that I thought as an original matter it had been wrongly decided. And that was what, within 18 years of its decision? Now it's been 46 years. And the department has stopped, under Republican administration, stopped as a routine matter, asking that it be overruled, and I don't see that being turned. I don't see that being resumed.
Would you defend Roe v. Wade if it were challenged?
Would I defend Roe v. Wade? I mean, usually the way this would come up would be a state regulation of some sort, and whether it's permissible under Roe v. Wade, and I would hope that the SG would make whatever arguments are necessary to address that. I think the justices the recent ones have made clear that they consider Roe v. Wade an established precedent. It's been on the books 46 years.
And you would enforce the Clinic Access Protection Act?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, congratulations on your nomination. Thank you for being here. You were eminently qualified for this position when you were confirmed unanimously by this committee 27 years ago, and you are eminently qualified today. It's a pleasure to have you here. I want to start where Senator Blumenthal started as well, with the reports about the FBI counterintelligence investigation launched against the president, which I also find to be stomach-turning, though perhaps for different reasons. The New York Times report indicates that the FBI began the probe in part because they were concerned about the president's foreign policy stances, comments he made during the 2016 campaign about foreign policy, and the Republican Party's official position on the Ukraine. In your experience with the FBI, is it strange to have a counterintelligence investigation begun because members of that bureau disagree with the foreign policy stances of a candidate for president or a president of the United States?
Yes.
The Supreme Court has been unequivocal that the president, in our system of government, the president possesses, and I'm going to quote now, the plenary and exclusive power as the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations, a power which does not require as a basis for its exercise an act of Congress. That's the very famous Curtis Wright case. To your knowledge, is that still good law?
Yes.
And do you think that was rightly decided?
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Would it concern you as Attorney General if FBI agents were making decisions about when and how to launch an investigation of an elected official if it was in order to avoid being supervised or directed by their agency leadership? Would that be concerning to you?
Yes.
As is, I might just add, reported by the New York Times. Let me switch gears and ask you about another topic that you mentioned a little bit earlier in the field when we were talking generally about antitrust. This is something, you talk about things that have changed in the 27 years since you were last here. One of the things that has changed is the extraordinary concentration of power in our economy in the hands of a few corporations, no more so than in Silicon Valley, which you referenced earlier today. And I just want to ask you a little bit about that. Big tech companies like, for instance, Google and Facebook, who have drawn much attention of late, pose significant challenges not just for competition, but also for the larger issues of privacy and the free flow of ideas. The Justice Department has recently deferred to the FTC across this range of issues, and while I'm hopeful that Chairman Simons will right the course here, the FTC has perhaps too often allowed these companies, in my view, to violate privacy and maybe antitrust laws without meaningful consequences. Here's my question. What role do you think the Justice Department has working with the FTC or independently to address anti-competitive conduct, potential bias, and privacy violations by these big tech companies?
Well, obviously, competition is of central concern to the antitrust division, and you know, there are, I guess, concordats that have been reached between the FTC and the antitrust division as to who has primary jurisdiction in different areas. But I would like to weigh into some of these issues. I'd like to have the antitrust support that effort to get more involved in reviewing the situation from a competition standpoint. I also am interested in the issue of privacy and the question of who owns this data. You know, it's not an area that I've studied closely or become an expert in, but I think it's important for the department to get more involved in these questions.
Just on the subject of ownership of data, as you know, Facebook is currently subject to a 2011 consent decree, as part of which it agreed not to release or share or sell personal user information without the knowledge and consent of its users. Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, has adamantly insisted under oath as recently as April 10th of 2018, that on Facebook, users have complete control, those are his words, over everything that they share. However, as I'm sure you're aware, recent media reports have indicated that Facebook, in fact, routinely has shared user information without users' consent or even knowledge. Now, the Justice Department has the authority to enforce the terms of the 2011 consent decree and potentially to prosecute any violation. Will you consider doing so?
Well, because that is something that I might have to get involved with and supervise if I'm confirmed, I'd rather not, you know, make any comments about it right now.
Let me ask you this. These same technology companies also control the flow of information, or at least influence it, the flow of information to consumers to an unprecedented degree. I mean, you have to go way back in American history to find any analog, back to the paper trust, to find an analog of a small group of companies that control the information and influence the news and its flow to Americans to the extent that these companies do. And there's growing evidence that these companies have leveraged their considerable market power, if not monopoly status, to disfavor certain ideological viewpoints, particularly conservative and libertarian viewpoints. Do you think the Department of Justice has authority under the antitrust laws or consumer protection laws or other laws to address bias by dominant online platforms?
I would just say generally, you know, I wouldn't think it would, you know, I'd have to think long and hard before I said that it was really the stuff of an antitrust matter. On the other hand, it could involve issues of disclosure and other implicate other laws like that.
Is there any point, do you think, at which political bias could require a response? And I'm thinking, for example, Harvard law professor Jonathan Zittrain has written how Google or Facebook, for example, could manipulate their algorithms to significantly swing voter turnout to favor a candidate of their choice. Would that sort of conduct require a response from the department?
I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure. I'd like to know more about the phenomena and what laws could be implicated by it.
Let me ask you this. The Justice Department's case against AT&T Time Warner focused on how the merged company would control or could control the distribution of information to discriminate against rival content. And I understand that you, of course, are recusing yourself from that matter. But generally speaking, do you see similar concerns regarding how dominant Silicon Valley firms could use their market power in social media or search to discriminate against rival products or services or viewpoints?
Yeah, and making clear that what I'm saying now has no application to, the transaction we just talked about, and talking about the other companies, yes.
Let me ask you more broadly about the question of antitrust and mergers, and you gestured towards this earlier in your testimony. I'm increasingly worried that the department is not enforcing vigorously the antitrust statutes in many sectors of the economy, not just technology. We see, again, as you've alluded to, we see growing concentration of power in various sectors held by just a few firms. And if you look at recent trends in the department's scrutiny of proposed mergers, it's at record lows. Last year, for instance, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division scrutinized mergers through second requests for information in less than 1% of all eligible cases. That is, I believe, the lowest level of merger scrutiny recorded since the FTC started tracking those statistics back in 1981. And just for comparison purposes, in 1981, that review was 5 times higher than it was in 2018. My question is, do you think that this record low level of merger scrutiny is appropriate? And if you're confirmed as Attorney General, what might you do to ensure that the Antitrust Division faithfully and vigorously enforces the law?
Well, I am for vigorous enforcement of the antitrust laws to preserve competition. And as I said, this is going to be an area I'm going to want to get into and work with Macon Delrahim on if I'm confirmed. I wouldn't necessarily use the incidence of merger review as a proxy for failure of competition. At the end of the day, it's competition we're worried about in different markets. But I am interested in exploring those, those statistics that you were just using.
And do you think it's fair to say, would you agree that the historic levels of concentration that we're seeing in many parts of the economy, technology in particular, is potentially detrimental to competition? I mean, it is, again, potentially and in general, but it is something that is worth scrutinizing and being concerned about if one is concerned about free, fair, and open competition.
You said the size?
Yes, the historic levels of concentration.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm concerned about are the network effects that are now at work, where they're so powerful that particular sectors could essentially be subsumed into these networks. They're just very powerful network effects because of the size.
Yes, I see my time has almost expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I welcome the arrival of the immigration Lindsey Graham of 2013. The other Lindsey Graham, we shall see, as you yourself have acknowledged. Mr. Barr, I ask these questions, these 2 questions of every nominee who comes before any of the committees on which I sit. And these are the questions. Since you became a legal adult, have you ever made unwanted requests for sexual favors or committed any verbal or physical harassment or assault of a sexual nature?
No.
Have you ever faced discipline or entered into a settlement related to this kind of conduct?
No.
I have a question relating to recusal. You've been asked a number of times. It is very clear that the President does not want an Attorney General who will recuse himself from the Mueller investigation. So when he came before us for confirmation in January 2017, Jeff Sessions wrote on his committee questionnaire that he would, quote, seek and follow the advice of the Department of Justice's designated agency ethics official if confronted with a conflict of interest, end quote. And in fact, he did do that, and he was basically pummeled by the president ever since. So Matthew Whitaker has not come before us for the job of Attorney General, but we know that when it came time to make a decision about recusal, he didn't want to be the object of Trump's wrath, so he proceeded to listen to and then ignore the advice of the career ethics officials at the DOJ who recommended recusal. So your answer to Senator Klobuchar's makes it clear that you are going to basically follow the Whitaker model. Can you understand why that is not terribly reassuring to us? These are not normal times. This is not 27 years ago. Today, the president is Donald Trump, who will do anything to protect himself. He wants you, who has written a manifesto about why the president shouldn't be prosecuted, at least for obstruction of justice, who has met with and consulted with the president's defense attorneys, who has written op-eds defending his firings of Sally Yates and James Comey to be his attorney general. So in this context, just asking us to trust you is not enough. Why won't you simply follow Jeff Sessions' lead and take and follow, the critical portion being follow, the advice of the department's ethics officials?
Because the regulations and the responsibilities of the Attorney General as the head of the agency vest that responsibility in the Attorney General. And I am not going to surrender the responsibilities of the Attorney General to get the title. I don't need the title. If you don't trust me you
have repeated that answer many, many times. However, I think we all acknowledge that Jeff Sessions possibly didn't want to recuse himself, but he did. And so you have it within your power to follow the ethics advice of your own department, and you're telling us you're not going to. So that is the bottom line.
No, Senator, I think Jeff Sessions recused himself because of a different provision, which was the political conflict provision.
I think
he played a role in
the
campaign.
In the context of all of the things that you have done, basically to get the attention of President Trump to nominate you, I would say that there's a political context to what your decision should be also. Let me move on. You have said that you will allow Mueller to complete his work, although, you know, I do want to ask you very specifically, because you did write that 19-page memo relating to the obstruction of justice issue. Would you allow the Mueller investigation with regard to obstruction of justice to also go forward unimpeded by you?
I don't know whether there's an investigation of obstruction of
Well, definitely obstruction of justice. You read the papers as well as we do, that is an element of the Mueller investigation. I don't think you can sit here and tell us that you do not think that that is a part of the investigation. But let's say that it is. Having written what you did, would you seek to stop that portion of the Mueller investigation? That being the obstruction of justice portion, assuming that that is in fact part of the investigation.
Okay, but you have to remember, my memo was on a very specific statute and a specific theory that I was concerned about. I have no basis for suspecting at this point that that is in play at all.
You mean that particular provision?
That provision or theory,
Well, I did say, let's assume that, in fact, obstruction of justice is part of the Mueller investigation.
When I say theory, I mean, what I was addressing was, you know, whether the removal of Comey in and of itself would be obstruction.
Of course, it's not
under a particular statute.
I hate to be interrupted, but, you know, I only have 4 minutes, so thank you very much. You were asked about the investigations that are going on in the Southern District of New York, the Eastern District of Virginia, the District of Columbia, and there are various investigations brought by various U.S. attorneys' offices relating to the activities of Donald Trump, his campaign, his inauguration, his foundation, his businesses, his families, his associates. Do you consider these to be lawful investigations? Because I believe that you responded to Senator Blumenthal that if these are lawful investigations by the U.S. Attorney's offices, that you do not see yourself interfering with them.
I have no reason to think they're not lawful investigations, whatever they are. You seem to know more than I do about what's under investigation.
That's reassuring that you're wanting to have the Mueller investigation go forward extends to all of these other U.S. Attorney's investigations. I believe you also said that the Mueller report will be confidential. It is confidential under the special counsel's, whatever the criteria are. So what I'm hearing you saying that in spite of the fact that you want to be transparent, neither Congress nor public will get the Mueller report because that's confidential. So what we will be getting is your report of the Mueller report, subject to applicable laws limiting disclosure. So is that what you're telling us?
I don't know what at the end of the day, what will be releasable. I don't know what Bob Mueller is writing.
Well, you said that the Mueller report is confidential pursuant to whatever the regulations are that applies to him. So I'm just trying to get as to what you're going to be transparent about.
As the rules stand now, people should be aware that the rules, I think, say that the independent, the special counsel will prepare a summary report on any prosecutive or declination decisions, and that shall be confidential and shall be treated as any other declination or prosecutive material within the department. In addition, the Attorney General is responsible for notifying and reporting certain information upon the conclusion of the investigation. Now, how these are going to fit together and what can be gotten out there, I have to wait, and I would have to wait. I'd want to talk to Rod Rosenstein and see what he has discussed with Mueller and what's, what.
But you have testified that you'd like to make as much of the original
right.
report
And so all I can say right now
as possible.
Yeah, all I can say right now is my goal and intent is to get as much information out as I can, consistent with the regulations.
So in the minute that I have, I'd just like to go over some of the policies that Jeff Sessions has followed. One is zero tolerance policy, which led to the separation of children from their parents. He refused to defend the Affordable Care Act and argued in the Texas lawsuit that key parts of the ACA was unconstitutional. He failed to bring a single lawsuit to enforce the Voting Rights Act to stop voter suppression efforts, and he issued a memo making it harder for the Civil Rights Division to enter into consent decrees to address systemic police misconduct. Do you agree with these policies? Do you intend to continue them?
Well, the last one, yes, I agree with that policy. The other ones, I'm not. I'd have to see what the basis was for those decisions.
So do you think that as to the last one, which has to do with consent decrees, that there is a role for the Department of Justice in addressing systemic police misconduct?
No,
you don't see much of a role in that, or you see a more limited role?
That's your characterization of it. That's not what I understand the policy to be. Of course, the department has a role on pattern and practice violations.
So the Attorney General Sessions has issued a rule that makes it a lot tougher to enter into these kinds of decrees.
Why do you say it's a lot tougher?
Because it's not just relying on the career attorneys, that now it goes to the deputy AG or whoever. There are more political appointees who are going to get involved in that process, and that makes it much more limited, I would say, in utilization. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Arano, we'll take a 10-minute comfort break and start with Senator Tillis. My math is right. We've got about an hour left on round one, so 10 minutes be okay, Mr. Barr? Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Adjourn for 10 minutes.
All right, everybody, good afternoon. Pilar Arias hopping onto the News Now set, going to say hello really quickly. Want to let you all know as well that we will for sure continue to have this Barr confirmation hearing. But again, I want to quickly say hello. We're going to get all caught up with some of the day's top stories and headlines as well while we are in that 10-minute break. Shouldn't be too much longer. But again, hello. Hope you all are having a fabulous Tuesday. Thanks so much for being with News Now, which is a part of Fox10Phoenix.com. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. You can then sign up for notifications and be alerted anytime we go live. And since we do have cameras not just here in Arizona, but nationwide, you never know when we might be in your neighborhood with some news you need to know about. Going to get some top stories ready for you, just about 3 or 4. And then we'll continue to listen on this Attorney General confirmation hearing. All right, so if you're just joining us here on the stream, there's 1,461 of you watching. Let's get you all up to speed with exactly what is going on with this Barr confirmation hearing.
As Attorney General, my allegiance will be to the rule of law, the Constitution, and the American people.
The president's pick to be the next Attorney General, William Barr, in the hot seat on Capitol Hill today.
Do you believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt against anybody?
I don't believe Mr. Mueller would be involved in a witch hunt.
In his opening remarks of his confirmation hearing, Barr telling the Senate Judiciary Committee he intends to let the Mueller investigation continue without interference.
The country needs a credible resolution to these issues. And if confirmed, I will not permit partisan politics, personal interests, or any other improper consideration to interfere with this or any other investigation.
The hearing, the first time a high-profile nominee has come before the committee since considering Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court last fall. If confirmed, Barr would replace acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, tapped by the president in November to temporarily head the Justice Department after Jeff Sessions announced he was stepping down.
Top of mind for all of us is the ongoing Mueller investigation. Importantly, the Attorney General must be willing to resist political pressure and be committed to protecting this investigation.
If confirmed, this will be William Barr's second stint as Attorney General, a position he held during the George H.W. Bush administration in the early 90s. In Washington, David Spunt, Fox News.
All right, for those of you here looking for that hearing live, they are currently on a break. We will bring it right back to you here on the News Now stream as soon as they pick things up again. But we're getting all caught up with some of the day's top stories and headlines from across the country. And this next one is about the alleged kidnapper's family in court. The Kloss alleged kidnapper, that is, Jamie Kloss, the 13-year-old Wisconsin teen who was missing for, I believe the total number was 88 days before police say that she escaped the home she was being held in and got some help. So let's get the latest there out of Wisconsin.
Mr. Patterson, what do you think about the allegations against your son? Did you know this was going on at your home?
With a shake of his head, Patrick Patterson denied knowing what was going on in the rural Wisconsin home where he raised his children, denied knowing his youngest son was holding a 13-year-old girl captive. In an emotional embrace following the court hearing, the suspect's father and brother console each other. Property records show the dad owned the home until October, when it became property of the bank. Yet the suspect, Jake Patterson, continued to live there. According to the criminal complaint, his father would come to the house, typically on Saturdays. The suspect would make Jamie hide under the bed, barricading her in, and turning up the radio to cover up any noise she might make. As the Pattersons left the courthouse hand in hand, they again said nothing. While on the other end of the parking lot, one of Jake Patterson's public defenders responded to Patterson's admission of guilt.
It doesn't stop the process. As I was saying before, I've seen criminal complaints that have had more that didn't stand up. Not saying anything about the validity of this one, but we have an obligation, a professional obligation to pursue things. Pursue all avenues, okay?
Well, rain is certainly in and around the Valley of the Sun, what's usually the Valley of the Sun. Here is a live look at our Fox Vision radar. You can see we are expecting more rainfall today, chances around 70%. And look, even Flagstaff, the high country, getting some snow as well. Take a look at current conditions outside right now. Plenty of clouds out there, but it certainly does feel very nice indeed, temperature-wise at least. A couple more top stories for you here while we wait for the Barr hearing to resume. This next one is about mudslides threatening at least one home in Southern California after all the torrential rainfall they got yesterday.
A wall of mud came crashing down into this Encino home, filling the guest house with several feet of debris and knocking it off its foundation. Homeowner Joyce Sachs says it's lucky nobody was there.
My grandson could have been in the guest house, and that is totally full of mud way up. He lost everything.
The slide happened late Monday afternoon after hours of steady rain hit the San Fernando Valley. The fire department says the hillside above the home became so saturated it just gave way, sliding right into the home on Boris Drive. Only Sachs's husband was there.
He was in the bedroom, and the whole thing went into the bathroom. Fortunately, it didn't come through that wall. And he said it was very loud. Horrible, horrible sound, like a big thunderbolt or something.
The Sachs family has left for the night. It's not safe to stay here. Right now, the mud is contained to their home, but a geologist surveying the hillside says a dozen other homes at the bottom of the hill are potentially in the slide zone.
We do have LAPD on scene, and we are in unified command with them. If we do need to start an evacuation, we're prepared to do that.
Firefighters are concerned about keeping this neighborhood safe, especially with more rain coming over the next few days.
Given the amount of saturation we've had already today, it's going to continue to get worse on this hill.
For those of you here for the Barr confirmation hearing, here is a live look at that hearing room where they are still on break. So don't worry, we will have it for you here until it ends today on News Now, which is part of Fox10Phoenix.com. Meanwhile, this next top story is about reducing opioid use after C-sections. Let's get the details.
You're looking so great. Dr. Julie Gelman is happy to see her patient, Lauren Beckos, is recovering.
Every day's been better.
The Denver woman delivered baby Abigail 4 weeks ago through C-section at Swedish Medical Center, and afterward she chose not to use any opioids for pain management.
I knew that if possible I wanted to avoid that because I knew about the addiction and because I was nursing.
Instead, Dr. Gelman placed a small catheter like this under the muscle that continuously released numbing medicine near the incision.
No opioids whatsoever.
The On-Q infusion pain pump has a large bulb of medicine that can be carried around and last 3 to 5 days. That, along with Tylenol and ibuprofen, was all that Lauren needed to manage the pain.
The pain was okay.
The On-Q pump has been used for years for other procedures, but this hospital just recently started using it after C-sections.
This is when pregnant moms are starting opioid use, and it could be an addiction problem and a long-term problem, and we're trying to reduce that.
Dr. Gelman is glad this is an option she can offer her patients.
I've seen lots of patients who like that we are making these changes.
And she says cutting back on opioids can also reduce nausea, vomiting, and constipation for those new moms who would rather be focused on their baby.
Abigail is so cute.
This option is available to C-section patients here at Swedish Medical Center, at Skyridge Medical Center, and at Presbyterian St. Luke's. Kim Posey, Channel 2 News.
All right, everyone. Well, got 2 more top stories for you ready to go, and that's A-OK because they are not back yet for the Barr confirmation hearing. This next top story we have for you here on News Now is about a push to ban juvenile solitary confinement.
I was in the cell all day, 3 meals, 1 10-minute phone call, and that was it.
Marcus Murray, like many teens placed in adult correctional facilities, found himself in isolation. For 72 hours, Marcus sat naked, alone, and afraid.
It just felt like it never ended.
Solitary confinement, a practice adopted by the American criminal justice system in the 1800s, it's now banned in federal prisons for anyone under the age of 18, which leaves lawyer and youth advocate Jessica Fireman wondering, how then are so many young people like Marcus subject to this treatment at the state and local level?
Courts are saying this is too harmful. It's cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. So the advocacy effort will be that every state eliminates solitary confinement.
Some medical experts agree and support advocates like Fireman, urging lawmakers to take into consideration the dangerous mental health impact.
It can have long-lasting effects on them. There will be a post-traumatic stress disorders, confusion, poor concentration, paranoia, feelings of hopelessness, demoralization, despair.
While many juvenile detention centers use confinement as a form of punishment, some state facilities have cited low funding or staff resources as to why they use the practice to separate underage inmates from the adult population. To date, 10 states have passed laws banning or limiting solitary confinement for juveniles. Fireman says this is a step in the right direction, but one that didn't come soon enough for Marcus, who still struggles with emotional and mental scars.
I'm always thinking about ever getting in trouble again, or ever going back again. Like, it's just like a constant nightmare. Like.
In Philadelphia, Talia Kirkland, Fox News.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, do you know of any instance in which anybody has tried to interfere in Mr. Mueller's investigation?
No, I mean, I'm not in the Department of Justice, and I have no, I'm not privy to that information, but I don't know anything.
I understand you know Mr. Mueller, do you?
Yes, I do.
Is he big enough to take care of himself?
He's a Marine.
Yeah. If someone had tried to interfere with his investigation, based on your knowledge of Mr. Mueller, would he have something to say about it, including but not limited to in a court of law?
Yes, Senator.
I want to try to cut through some of the innuendo here. Did President Trump instruct or ask you, once you become Attorney General, to fire Mr. Mueller?
Absolutely not.
Did he ask you to interfere in Mr. Mueller's investigation?
Absolutely not.
Has anybody in the White House made that suggestion to you?
Absolutely not.
Has anybody in the Western Hemisphere made that suggestion to you?
Absolutely not.
Okay. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Blumenthal about the FBI being the premier law enforcement agency in the history of the world, in my opinion, in the high esteem in which we all hold the Department of Justice. But I have a question for you. This counterintelligence investigation that was started by FBI and Justice allegedly about President Trump. How did the New York Times get that information?
I don't know, Senator.
Well, didn't it have to come from the FBI or the Department of Justice?
I just can't say. I don't know how they got it, and I don't know whether that's an accurate report.
Right. What do you intend to do about the leaks coming out of the FBI and the Department of Justice?
The problem of leaks is a difficult one to address. I think the first thing is to make it clear that there's an expectation that there are no leaks, and punish people through internal discipline if there are leaks. Also keep exercise more compartmentalization and discipline. And make the institutions that are responsible, if you're talking about the FBI, that their leadership is taking aggressive action to stop the leaks.
Okay. You've had some experience with the enforcement of our immigration laws, is that correct?
That's right, Senator.
Do you believe it is possible to secure a 1,900-mile border without, in part at least, using barriers?
No, I don't think it's possible.
Okay.
When I was Attorney General, we had the INS as part of the department, and I remember another part of my kibitzing was trying to persuade George W. Bush's administration not to break that out. But in those days, I had some studies done, and I was trying within the budget to put as much as we could on the barriers as we could.
Okay. Do you believe that ICE should be abolished, as some of my colleagues do?
Certainly not.
Okay. You're Roman Catholic, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Do you think that disqualifies you from serving in the United States government?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Why is that?
Why doesn't it disqualify me?
Mm-hmm. Some of my colleagues think it might.
Because you render under Caesar that which is Caesar's, and under God that which is God, and I believe in the separation of church and state. And if there was something that was against my conscience, I wouldn't impose it on others. I would resign my office.
Yeah, I think it's called freedom of religion.
Yes,
as I recall.
That's right.
If the federal government threatens to withhold federal money from a university, if that university doesn't investigate, prosecute, punish sexual assault in a way prescribed by the federal government, does that make the state university a state actor, or the university a state actor?
It may. I would have to look at the cases. I'm not up to speed on those, but I would think so.
Well, if the federal government says to a university, look, if you do not prosecute, investigate, punish allegations of sexual assault in a way that that the federal government says you must, otherwise we're going to take away your federal money. Does the accused in one of those sexual assault allegations still have the protection of the Bill of Rights?
I would hope so.
Should he or her?
I'd have to look and see exactly the state actor law right now. But what you're getting at is, the rules that were forced on universities in handling sexual harassment cases,
right,
that I felt essentially did away with due process.
Yes.
And I think the victim, as a father of three daughters, I take very seriously any question of sexual harassment, it's a serious problem, and the word of a victim has to be taken very seriously, and it has to be pursued. But we can't do it at the expense of the Bill of Rights or basic fairness and due process.
Both the accused and the accuser deserve due process, do they not?
That's right.
Okay. Tell me what the legal basis is for a universal injunction.
I think universal injunctions are have no. Well, let me say that they are a recent vintage. They really started arising in the '60s, and I think that they have lost sight of a limitation on the judicial power of the United States, which is case or controversy.
It's all based on the D.C. Circuit.
Right.
Case. The Wirtz case, is that right?
I forgot the name of the case, but I think the D.C. Circuit case was the first one. I think that was in the '60s, and people have lost sight of the fact that it's really a question of who gets the relief in a case, and under the case or controversy, it should be limited to the parties. And when earlier. You could have a court in one jurisdiction decide it, and that would be the rule in that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. But that didn't debar the government from continuing its policies elsewhere, and eventually you'd get differences, and they would work their way up to the Supreme Court. So I think that I'd like to see these universal injunctions challenged.
Well, I don't know how many federal district court judges we have. Let's say 650. As I understand it, one can enjoin a congressional statute nationwide, even if the other 624 judges disagree.
That's right.
All right.
And not just a statute, Senator. I think what's different, what we're seeing is the willingness of courts to set aside, even the kinds of exercises of national security power that, 20 years ago would have been unimaginable for a court to challenge. And yet a district court judge somewhere can enjoin some action that has a bearing on the safety of the nation. And then the judicial process can take years and years to get that up to the Supreme Court.
I've just got a few seconds left. As I understand your testimony, General, Mr. Mueller will write a report, submit it to you as Attorney General, and then you will write a report based on that report and release your report. Is that right?
That's essentially it, but I wouldn't assume, it could easily be that the report is communicated to the department before, assuming I was confirmed. That could be a month away.
Well, let me tell you what I'm getting at. I've got 6 seconds. Now 4. The American people deserve to know what the Department of Justice has concluded. And they're smart enough to figure it out. I've said this before. The American people don't read Aristotle every day. They're too busy earning a living. But if you give them the facts, they'll figure it out, and they'll draw their own conclusions. Doesn't matter who spins them. They'll figure it out for themselves. And I would strongly encourage you to put this all to rest, to make a report, a final report, public, to let everybody draw their own conclusions so we can move on. If somebody did something wrong, they should be punished. But if they didn't, let's stop the innuendo and the rumors and the leaking, and let's move on.
I agree, Senator. And let me say, earlier I misspoke because the acting Attorney General is Matt Whitaker, and I referred to Rod as the acting Attorney General, but in fact the report would go to Matt Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to remark, Mr. Barr, that your family is showing a prodigious level of patience and indefatigable endurance, and that should be marked for the record. You're a very lucky man. You know that about 30-plus states have legalized medical marijuana or adult use. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes.
In 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memorandum, which provided guidance to U.S. attorneys that the federal marijuana prohibition should not be enforced in states that have legalized marijuana in one way or the other. Do you believe it was the right decision to rescind the Cole Memorandum?
My approach to this would be not to upset settled expectations and the reliance interests that have arisen as a result of the Cole Memoranda, and investments have been made, and so there have been reliance on it. So I don't think it's appropriate to upset those interests. However, I think the current situation is untenable and really has to be addressed. It's almost like a backdoor nullification of federal law. To me, it's a binary choice. Either we have a federal law that applies to everybody.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how would you address that? Well, do you think it's appropriate to use federal resources to target, marijuana businesses that are in compliance with state laws?
No, I said that. Yeah. That's what I said. I'm not going to go after companies that have relied on the Cole Memoranda. However, we either should have a federal law that prohibits marijuana everywhere, which I would support myself, because I think it's a mistake to back off on marijuana. However, if we want a federal approach, if we want states to have their own laws, then let's get there, and let's get there the right way.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to just move on. But it's good to hear at least the first part of what you said. During your previous 10 years Attorney General, you literally wrote the book on mass incarceration, or at least wrote this report, The Case for More Incarceration. You argued that we as a nation were, quote, incarcerating too few criminals
in those days,
and that the solution was more incarceration for more people.
Excuse me.
Please, sir.
For chronic violent offenders and gun offenders.
Well, I mean that's the challenge, sir. And you argued against the bipartisan legislation in 2015 quite strenuously.
I did.
But that's not the nature of incarceration in this country. In fiscal year 2016, only 7.7% of the federal prison population was convicted of violent crimes. Overwhelmingly, what was initiated in those times that led to an 800% increase in the federal prison population, overwhelmingly, that was nonviolent drug offenders. Right now, our federal prison population is overwhelmingly nonviolent. 47.5% of the federal prison population are incarcerated for drug offenses. And I guess hearing your arguments then and hearing your arguments against the bipartisan legislation that we brought out of the committee in 2016.
But Senator, I think that's wrong, what you just said, okay? I think when you have violent gangs in the city, killing people, murder, and so forth and so on, sometimes the most readily provable charge is their drug trafficking offenses, rather than proving culpability of the whole gang for murder. So you can take out a gang on drug offenses, and you could be taking out a lot of violent offenders. Do you think that the murders in Chicago are they're related to gangs, and again, gangs involved in
and we can get into the data if you'd like, and I'd like to get some more pointed questioning. But this is the sort of these are sort of the tropes that make people believe that in inner cities we should have such profound incarceration rates. And I'd like to ask you specifically about that data, because I think it's language like that makes me kind of concerned and worried. You said you hadn't reviewed. You said earlier in your testimony you hadn't reviewed criminal justice data about this actual issue of incarceration versus non-incarceration. I just want to know, will you commit to commissioning a study on just the concerns that we're talking about right now about the efficacy of reducing mass incarceration and publish those results? Would you be willing to do such a study yourself?
Well, as I understand it, I've been told that there's a lot of data to support the First Step Act.
Yeah, and that First Step Act goes directly towards addressing a lot of the problems we've had in mass incarceration. And so if you're saying that it is necessary to deal with violence in communities by over-incarcerating, here's a bipartisan group of senators that's working towards reducing mass incarceration. And that's why I think it's very important, which I appreciate you saying you didn't know because you hadn't reviewed the data. I think it's very important that you review the data and understand the implications for the language that you're using, which brings up this language of race, which is often not said explicitly, but when you talk about Chicago in the way you just did, it brings up racial fears or racial concerns. And you stated that if a black and a white, this is quoting you directly, are charged with the same offense, generally they will get the same treatment in the system and ultimately the same penalty. You previously quoted, and I quote you again, there's no statistical evidence that there of racism in the criminal justice system. Do you still believe that?
No, what I said was that, I think that's taken out of a broader quote, which is the whole criminal justice system involves both federal but also state, local justice systems. And I said there's no doubt that there are places where there is racism still in the system. But I said overall, I thought that as a system, it's working. It's not predicated on.
So can I press you on that? Overall, the system treats blacks and whites fairly. From my own experience, I've lived in affluent communities. I've gone to the college campuses with you. There are certain drug laws applied there that's very different than the inner city community in which I live. But let's talk stats. Let's not talk our personal experiences. And so I've sat with many of my colleagues and many conservatives who readily admit what the data shows. And so I have a whole bunch of reports which I'll enter into the record from nonpartisan, bipartisan groups, even conservative leaders talking about the rife nature of racial bias within the system. For example, the federal government's own data, the U.S. Sentencing Commission's research shows that federal prosecutors are more likely to charge blacks with offenses that carry harsh mandatory minimum sentences than similarly situated for whites. The federal government's own data shows that black defendants were subject to 3-strike sentencing enhancements at a statistically significantly higher rate, which added on average over 10 years to their sentences. And so with numerous researchers having found stunning racial disparities rife throughout our system and in the federal system, which you will be the chief law enforcement officer of, and primarily for overwhelmingly for drug laws. For example, I don't know if you're aware or not of the Brookings study that found that blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs, despite the fact that whites are actually more likely to sell drugs in the United States of America, and blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession of drugs when there is no difference racially in America for the usage and possession of drugs in the United States. I don't know if are you familiar with the Brookings study?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so just to follow up, will you commit to commissioning a study examining racial disparities and the disparate impacts of the policies that you talked about that led to mass incarceration, the policies that you defended when you criticized the bipartisan 2015 sentencing reform legislation? Will you commit to, at least as the most important law enforcement officer in the land, to studying those well-documented racial disparities and the impacts it has?
Of course I'll commit to studying that, and I'll have the Bureau of Justice Statistics pull together everything they have, and if there's something lacking, I'll get that, and I'm interested in the state experience. But when I looked at this, I think 1992 was a different time, Senator. The crime rate had quintupled over the preceding 30 years, and it peaked in 1992. And it's been coming down since 1992.
And sir, I just want to tell you, I was a young black guy in 1990s. I was a 20-something-year-old. And experienced a dramatically different justice system in the treatment that I received. Okay. And the data of racial disparities and what it's done to black communities, because you literally said this about black communities, and I know that your heart was in the right place. You said that, hey, I want to help black communities. This is what you're saying. The benefits of incarceration would be enjoyed disproportionately by black Americans living in inner cities. You also said that, quote, a failure to incarcerate hurts black Americans most.
And I'll tell you what.
And I just want to ask you a yes or no question, because I have seconds left. Do you believe now, 30, 40 years of mass incarceration, targeted disproportionately towards African Americans, harsher sentences, disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, with the American Bar Association talking about once you've been incarcerated for even a low-level drug crime, there are 40,000 collateral consequences that impact your life. Jobs, Pell Grants, loans from banks. do you think, just yes or no, that this system of mass incarceration has disproportionately benefited African-American communities? Yes or no, sir?
I think the reduction in crime has since 1992, but I think that the heavy drug penalties, especially on crack and other things, have harmed the black community. The incarceration rates have harmed the black community.
And I would just conclude to my chairman and partner, thank you, sir, on this, because I'm really grateful for this bipartisan group, the Heritage Foundation. I've spoken at the AEI conference, just found such great partnership, but I worry about the highest law enforcement officer in the land and some of the language I still hear you using that goes against the data, and that you're going to be expected to oversee a justice system that you and I both know needs the faith and confidence of communities, that has dramatically lost that confidence because of implicit racial bias. And the DOJ, and I'll give you a chance to respond, the DOJ itself has mandated implicit racial bias training, and I hope that's something that you will agree to do. But this is the thing I'll conclude on, is that we live on a planet Earth where you can tell the most about a nation by who they incarcerate. In Turkey, they incarcerate journalists. Thank God we don't do that here, even though they've been called the enemy of the people. In Russia, they incarcerate political opponents. I'm glad we don't do that, even though with chance of lock her up. But you go into the American criminal prisons, sir, and you see the most vulnerable people. You see over-stigmatized mentally ill people clogging our system. You see over-stigmatized addicted people clogging our system. You see a system where, as Brian Stevenson says, it treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And you see disproportionately, overwhelmingly for drug crimes, African Americans and Latinos being incarcerated. The importance of your job, and I'll ask you this last question, because you haven't met with me yet, you've given that courtesy to others. Would you please meet with me in my office so you and I can have a heart-to-heart on the urgency, the cancer on the soul of our country's criminal justice system is the disproportionate impact of that system on those vulnerable communities, including women. Over 80% of whom the women we incarcerate are survivors of sexual trauma. Can you and I sit down and have a longer conversation than these 10 minutes will allow on this issue?
I'd very much welcome that, Senator. My experience back in 1992, when sort of blood was running on the streets all over the United States, my ideas were actually first formed when I went to Trenton. And the African-American community there essentially surrounded me and was saying, look, we're in our golden years. We're trying to enjoy our golden years, and we can't even go outside our house. We have bars on our house and so forth. Please, these gangs are running roughshod. So I developed this idea called weed and seed. And my attitude was, look, let's stop arguing past each other on let's attack root causes and let's get tough on crime. And I felt that for programs to work, like after-school programs and so forth, for all this, for housing projects to be safe, we needed strong enforcement in those communities, and we needed those other programs to be brought to bear community by community. And it had to be done with the leadership of the community, and that was this idea of the partnership. And it caught on. It was very popular. And in fact, it was continued by a lot of the U.S. attorneys in the Clinton administration after the Bush administration was out. And it actually, under a number of different names, has continued. So I'm very conscious of the issues you raise, but my goal is to provide and my motivation was to provide safety in these neighborhoods for the people trying to raise their children and for the older people and so forth. And I think the neighborhoods are, the crime rate has gone down. I make a distinction between the way we treat these chronic violent offenders and the drug penalties. The drug penalties, as I said, very high and draconian, and in some cases that might have been necessary, but I supported revisiting the penalty structure.
And, sir, I'm the only United States senator that lives in an inner-city, low-income community. I've had shootings in my neighborhood. A young man killed last year on my block with an assault weapon. I know this urgent need for safety and security, and I'm not saying I'm necessarily going to vote for you one way or the other, but I believe your intentions are well, but I think that some of the things you've said in the past lead me to believe that your policies might be misguided in the way that Mike Lee and Cornyn and Graham and Grassley have been incredible partners in changing the American reality. I hope that you you can be that kind of partner too, and I hope that you and I can have a good heart-to-heart conversation, trusting that we both want the same end for all communities, safety and security, but a justice system that is fair to all American citizens.
I'd welcome that, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate your time today, Mr. Barr, and that of your family. I told Liam that Grandpa ought to give him whatever he wants to eat for dinner tonight. He has behaved very well and done a great job. Going back to something that Senator Kennedy mentioned on leaks, and you said you would address that by compartmentalization. Talk for just a little bit about your vision for the Department of Justice as you look at implementing first steps, addressing violent crime, dealing with the opioids, dealing with online sex trafficking, the antitrust issues, the Mueller investigation, all the things we've talked about. How do you intend to lead that department that is very different from the DOJ that you led previously?
In some ways it's different, in some ways it's not so different, but my basic approach to things is to get good lieutenants, good subordinates who are running different parts of the agenda, and give them their marching orders and watch them perform and get involved to the extent I can to make sure that we're pushing the priorities things ahead. One of the interesting things about the Department of Justice, it's a little different than many agencies, is one of our first priority has to be to enforce all the law. It's not like we can just come into work and say, well, we're going to just pay attention to this, so we're not going to enforce all these other laws. We have to cover the waterfront. That's number one. But beyond that, what I tried to do last time and what I would try to do if you confirm me this time would be, to make sure that even though we're enforcing things across the board, we have an understood set of priorities and we put the effort behind those priorities. And we define clearly what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, in the area of civil rights, when I was Attorney General last time, and I had discussed this with Senator Kennedy, I said, we're not doing enough on housing discrimination. Housing is very important. It determines where you go to school and all, the safety and so forth. And I set up a program. We hired testers and stuff like that. And we had a very clear goal and priority for that. And we launched it. And that's what I plan to bring in area after area, defining what we're trying to accomplish and give the people the tools to get it done and give them the direction and motivation to get it done.
You've mentioned the Mueller investigation, your relationship with Mr. Mueller, having him finish the investigation. If we were to ask him about you, do you think his assessment would be that you are a fair and impartial leader that he can trust, that we can trust to lead the DOJ?
I hope he would say that, but I'm not going to put words in his mouth.
Yeah, we talked about technology and my interest in that area, and you've had Mr. Lee and Mr. Hawley have also talked about antitrust and some of the enforcement there. Big tech and Silicon Valley and the power that is harbored there, they are gobbling up a lot of their competitors. You've got Facebook and Google that are claiming to only be platforms for their users, but they are also getting into the content business. And that is why Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp, and Google bought YouTube and DeepMind for AI technology. So their tentacles are spreading, and they are moving away from a platform into that content, into artificial intelligence, and their market dominance is causing some problems. And as as we discussed, these companies are violating users' privacy. They are recklessly sharing their users' personal data with third parties. This is done without explicit permission. We can't let these companies collude to drive out competitors or to ignore vital data privacy protections. And big tech operated really without regard to the law. And you and I talked a little bit about one of the edge provider CEOs who last spring, when he came before a House committee, he was also here before this committee, there was even reference to how I discussed how he subjectively manipulated, or asked if he subjectively manipulated algorithms, and how there was concern that some of these platforms referencing a statement he had made function more like a government than a platform or an information service. So how do you intend to begin this conversation and begin this work addressing the antitrust provisions with big tech?
Yes, you know, as I mentioned, I'm interested in these issues and would like to have them fully ventilated at the department with the antitrust division and also with, you know, outside experts, so I can have a better understanding. I do want to say, however, that I'm going to be recusing myself from AT&T because
Time Warner, yeah.
Yeah, because now Time Warner is part of AT&T, right. And I was told that under the rules that will carry over to AT&T. So until I talk to the ethics advisors of the department, I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis and sort of talking about the tech area. But as a general policy matter, I want to get into this area because I think it's on a lot of people's minds and how the law relates to these you know, to these developments that we see with these large companies. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on any particular company or executive.
Well, and I think for many of us, if you're looking at a merger and they cannot prove the efficiencies and they cannot prove that there will be increased competition, then it does raise some questions as to how those would be evaluated. And let me go to one other issue that is developing on this privacy front. It is a data privacy problem that I don't think a lot of people realize, and it is the embedding of hardware and then the geolocation. And sometimes that information is sold. Now, it folds into the encryption issue because law enforcement has a very difficult time getting the information from devices and from the services on encryption. But we are now aware that many times bounty hunters will be paid a few $100s, and then they can go in and find the location of that phone. And some of these Android operating systems are specific enough that they do the barometric pressure readings, and they can tell you exactly where in a building that this phone is located. So I would hope that you are going to look at the legal procedures that surround this kind of data and this kind of tracking and the privacy provisions that are going to pertain to consumers as they use these devices.
Yes.
Good. Thank you. Let me move on. Senator Ernst talked a little bit about the online sex trafficking. In Tennessee, we have followed this issue so closely because our TBI carried out an operation where they apprehended 22 traffickers. 22 men were arrested for sex trafficking, and much of that work and the work I've done in the House on the online sex trafficking, working to shut down Backpage.com and to keep our children and keep women safe from these online traffickers. And, you know, we were so pleased that last April, the Justice Department seized a back page and charged 7 defendants for facilitating prostitution and sex trafficking crimes. And what we know is that when you shut down a site like Backpage, the big one, then you have a lot of small sites that proliferate. And we know that it is going to really take a lot of effort to arrest this situation so that you're not constantly playing whack-a-mole with these. So I would hope that you will be committed to putting an end to this kind of violence and online trafficking.
Yes, and I know how focused you are on it and the leadership you've provided over the years on it. I don't know that much about the problem and also about what resources are currently being devoted to it in the department, but I would like to come by and talk to you further about it once I get exposed to it, if I'm confirmed. Okay.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations. And to you, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you for your lifetime of dedication to public service.
Thank you.
In response to a question that Senator Ernst asked, you mentioned that we need barriers across the border to deal with drug trafficking. Are you advocating a wall?
Well, I think I'm advocating a system, a barrier system. In some places, and I'd have to find out more about the situation since I last visited the border.
From what you know, do you believe that a wall would address the concern that you have about drug trafficking?
Well, the wall certainly would, but in some places it may not be necessary to have, what most people imagine as a wall.
Are you aware that most of the drugs coming into the United States, in particular through Mexico, are entering through ports of entry?
Yes, but they also come elsewhere, and so do illegal immigrants cross the border. And
but
basically,
in particular on the subject of drug trafficking, are you aware that most of the drugs that are trafficked into the United States enter through points of entry?
Yes.
Have you recently or ever visited a point of entry, a port of entry?
Not
in the United States?
Not recently.
When
I
was
used
the
to
last
spend
time?
a lot of time. Well, when I was Attorney General.
So a couple decades ago.
Almost 30 years.
Okay. I'd urge you to visit again if and when you are confirmed. I think you'll see that a lot has changed over the years. Given status quo on marijuana and the fact that 10 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized marijuana, and given that the status quo is what it is, and as you rightly described, we have federal laws and then there are various states that have different laws. If confirmed, are you intending to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in the states that have legalized marijuana?
No, I thought I answered that by saying that to the extent people are complying with the state laws, in distribution and production and so forth, we're not going to go after that.
Okay.
But I do feel we can't stay in the current situation because, if you can imagine any kind of situation, can an existing administration and an attorney general start cutting deals with states to say, well, we're not going to apply the federal law, some gun law or some other thing, and say, well, we're not going to apply it in your state.
I appreciate your point, but specifically, and I appreciate you answering the question, you do not intend to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in those states or in the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana.
That's right, but I think the Congress of the United States, it's incumbent on the Congress to regularize, make a decision as to whether we're going to have a federal system or whether it's going to be, a central federal law, because this is breeding disrespect for the federal law.
I agree with you. I believe Congress should act. I agree. Earlier today, Senator Leahy asked whether you would follow the recommendation of career Department of Justice ethics officials on whether you should recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation. You said, quote, "I will seek the advice of the career ethics personnel, but under the regulations, I make the decisions as the head of the agency as to my own recusal." You also said to Senator Klobuchar that you do not want to, quote, abdicate your duty since recusal decision would be yours. So my question is, would it be appropriate to go against the advice of career ethics officials that have recommended recusal? And can you give an example of under what situation or scenario you would go against their recommendation that you recuse yourself?
Well, there are different kinds of recusals. Some are mandated, for example, if you have a financial interest, but there are others that are judgment calls. And
let's imagine it's a judgment call, and the judgment by the career ethics officials in the agency are that you recuse yourself. Under what scenario would you not follow their recommendation?
If I disagreed with it.
And what would the basis of that disagreement be?
I came to a different judgment.
On what basis?
The facts.
Such as?
Such as whatever facts are relevant to the recusal.
What do you imagine the facts would be that are relevant to the recusal?
They could be innumerable. I mean, there are a lot of, for example, there's a rule of necessity, like who else would be handling it. It could be.
Do you believe that would be a concern in this situation if you are, if the recommendation is that you recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation? Do you believe that would be a concern, that there'd be no one left to do the job?
Just saying, well, in some contexts, there very well might be because of, who's confirmed for what and who's in what position. But apart from that, it's a judgment call, and the Attorney General is the person who makes the judgment, and that's what the job entails.
As a general matter, that's true, but specifically on this issue, under what scenario would you imagine that you would not follow the recommendation of the career ethics officials in the Department of Justice to recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation?
If I disagreed with them.
Okay. We'll move on. Senator Feinstein previously asked you whether you'd put your June 2018 memo, whether you put together that memo based on non-public information. Your response was that you, quote, did not rely on confidential information. Are you creating a distinction between non-public information and confidential information?
No.
Okay. In response to a question from Senator Durbin about harsh sentencing laws, you stated in response to the crack epidemic that community leaders, back when you were Attorney General previously, asked for these types of sentencing laws. Now, my understanding is that many of these community leaders at that time, and I was a young prosecutor during those days, knew and said even then that the crack epidemic was a public health crisis, and that was really the chorus coming from community leaders, not that they wanted drug-addicted people to be locked up. And similarly, now we can find that in most of the communities afflicted by the opioid crisis, they are similarly, these community leaders, asking that it be addressed for the public health crisis that it is. So my question is, if and when you are confirmed in this position, would you agree that when we talk about the opioid crisis, the crisis in terms of methamphetamine addiction or any other controlled substance, that we should also acknowledge the public health ramifications and causes, and that there is a role for the chief law enforcement officer of the United States to play in advocating for a public health response and not only a lock-em-up response?
Well, I think the commission that was chaired by Governor Chris Christie came up with a three-pronged strategy, and I think that recognized that part of it was treatment and education, recovery, and prevention. But the third prong of it was enforcement and interdiction, and that's the job of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice can't be all things to all people.
Sir, but I would suggest to you that in the intervening almost 30 years since you were last Attorney General, that there is consensus in the United States that when we look at the drug epidemic, whatever the narcotic may be, that there's now an understanding that the war on drugs was an abject failure, that America, frankly, has a crisis of addiction, and that putting the limited resources of our federal government into locking up people who suffer from a public health crisis is probably not the smartest use of taxpayer dollars. So if confirmed, I'd ask that you take a look at the more recent perspective on the drug crisis that is afflicting our country. And then I'll move on. Today, there is $1 billion.
Can I just say something in response to that?
Sure.
Which is, I was just making the observation that the job of the Department of Justice is enforcement. I recognize realize there are a lot of dimensions to the problem, and that's why we have places like HHS. The department can't do the job of everybody.
Sir, but I would remind you what you said, because I agree with it. You said earlier the role of the Attorney General, one, is to enforce the rule of law, 2 is a legal advisor to the President and the Cabinet, and 3 is policy. This is a policy issue, so I'd urge you to emphasize that role and power that you will have if confirmed, and think of it that way.
I see, yeah.
I'd like to talk with you about private prisons. There is a $1 billion private prison industry that profits off of incarcerating people, and frankly as many as possible. By one estimate, the 2 largest private prison companies in the United States make a total combined profit of $3.3 billion. That's what it'd be, dollars a year. In August of 2016, the Justice Department issued a report on the Bureau of Prisons' use of private prisons that concluded, quote, contract prisons incurred more safety and security incidents per capita than comparable Bureau of Prisons institutions. Given this conclusion that prisons run by for-profit companies have been found to be less safe than government-run prisons, if confirmed, will you commit to no longer renew private prison contracts?
Whose report was this? BOP?
This was, yes, from the Justice Department.
Yeah, I'd like to, I would obviously look at that report. Yes.
Okay, and then...
But I'm not committing. I mean, I'd want to see what the report says.
Sure. Yeah. And then I'd appreciate a follow-up when you have a chance to read it. Thank you. My time's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barr, thank you for being here, and Liam, your granddaddy's doing good. Mr. Barr, I want to go back because it's a long time. I think I'm the last person in the first round, so I think we have to go back and maybe have you restate some things that you said earlier before I get to a few other things that I hope I have time to cover on intellectual property, Americans with Disability Act, and a GAO report back from 2014. I do have to ask a question while Senator Kennedy's here, because I don't think he covered the full landscape. He asked about anybody in government, anyone in the Western Hemisphere, but did you in fact talk to anybody in the Eastern Hemisphere with respect to the Mueller probe?
No, I didn't.
Okay, thank you. We got that.
Ask him about the Milky Way.
We got that closed out. Would you go back again and please describe for me the first off, I think you've made it very clear, in spite of the fact some people thought that you had coaching and some of the citations in the memo that you read, that this was a memo you wrote on your own. Can you explain to me again the motivation behind the memo, what precisely you were trying to communicate, just for the record?
Yes, Senator. So the public commentary and media commentary was sort of dominated by discussion of obstruction of justice, and everyone was throwing out obstruction theories and so forth. And the statute that relates to obstructing a proceeding that's not yet in being, that is some future proceeding, is 1512. And my view was of the particular provision, 1512C, was that it requires, what it covers is obstruction by means of impairing evidence, that you know some evidence is going to be needed in a future proceeding, and you impair it either by making it not available or by corrupting it in some way, altering it, destroying it. That's what I thought the scope of that statute dealt with. And to my knowledge, the only cases ever brought under it involved the destruction of evidence. Based on public reports, which may be completely wrong, I thought that it was being that the special counsel may be trying to interpret the statute to say that any act, not destruction of evidence or anything, but any act that influences a proceeding is a crime if it's done with a bad intent. My concern there is that unlike something like bribery statute or document destruction where you prohibit it, that's a bad act. You don't need to be performing that bad act if you're a government official. But if you say that any act that influences a proceeding is a crime if you have a bad state of mind, That's what the people at Justice Department do every day of the week, is influence proceedings. That's what they're there for. And what I was worried about is the impact on the department and other agencies. If you say to someone, if you, in supervising a case or handling a case, make a decision for a bad intent, it can be a crime. And I thought that that would essentially paralyze the government. So just to give an example, you know, Eric Holder made some pardon recommendations during the Clinton administration, which were controversial. Incidentally, I supported Eric Holder for his position. But could someone come along then later and say, well, if you did that for a political reason to help Hillary Clinton run in New York, that's a crime? And when he's exercising his prerogatives, you know, in that situation, and you can just see how that could paralyze government, and that was my concern.
You also referred to your concerns with the prosecution of Senator Menendez. Did that weave into that same thought process?
Yes, because in that case, my concern was that they were basically taking activities that were not, you know, wrongful acts in themselves. You know, the political contributions were lawful political contributions, and the things with, you know, the travel on his friend, that was his friend for 25 years. They were taking a trip together. And you take those kinds of things and then you couple it with official action, and then the prosecutor comes along and says, well, we're going to look into your mind and see what your subjective intent was for performing these two sets of lawful acts, and we're going to say, you know, that you're corrupt. Good. So I just think that gives too much power to the prosecutor, and I think if that kind of, and by the way, you know, they've had cases like this for, you know, I mean, they've been pursuing things like this, and they've had to be slapped down a few times by the Supreme Court on these kinds of aggressive things involving, you know, quid pro quos on the Hill. So
let me, if I can, thank you. I just thought it was helpful because I think you tried to explain a lot of that and you were cut off, so I thought I'd use some of my time in the first round to ask you that. Also, I think somebody tried to characterize you as having somehow been opposed to any sort of Russia probe or Russia investigations. Have you ever gone on record as opposing any of the things that we're trying to do to figure out where Russia may have been involved in election tampering?
No, and in fact, in the op-ed piece where I said I thought the president was right in firing Comey, I said that the investigation was going forward under the supervision of Rod Rosenstein. Yeah,
did you also say more than one time that you felt like the special counsel investigation should reach a conclusion, that that Special Counsel Mueller shouldn't be that he should be allowed to draw this to a conclusion, then he will submit his report, and you're going to do everything that you can to present as much of that information as you can, as you can, to the extent that confidential information is not being compromised?
To the extent the regulations permit it, yeah.
Did you also say that there's even a scenario where you can't imagine a scenario for cause, but even a scenario for cause where you'd have to take under serious consideration before you remove special counsel?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
There hasn't been a special counsel removed since Archibald Cox, and that didn't work out.
Didn't work out too well, right. And so, and again, did you also say that in no circumstances have you had a discussion with the president with respect to, I think you said you had a discussion about you had a relationship with Mr. Mueller, but no discussion about the special counsel investigation and your opinions on it with respect to any discussions you've had with the president?
Right. That was the first meeting I had with the president, and then in November I met with him about the Attorney General job, and there was no discussion of the substance of the investigation. The president didn't ask me my views about any aspect of the investigation, and he didn't ask me about what I would do about anything in the investigation.
With respect to the line of questioning about the states that have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal purposes or recreational purposes, I think what you were trying to say in a very, very respectful way is it's not your job to do our job. Is that right? That if we ultimately want to provide certainty for these businesses. You've done a good job in saying that you disagree with the policy of the states, but we are where we are, and you would not want to undermine that given that investments have been made, states have moved forward. But at the end of the day, we should stop talking about it here and making it your job. And those members, I don't happen to be one of them, who think that we should take these federal laws off the books should probably file a bill and try and get it done. Is that a fair assessment of your opinion?
That's generally fair, yes.
Okay. Just a few minor things so that we can get to the next round. There was a report by the Inspector General in 2014 that had to do with accountability in the Department of Justice. I don't expect you to be familiar with this report, but there were some very interesting observations there about a lack of follow-through on disciplinary action for a number of I think the subtitle of the report was "The DOJ Could Strengthen Procedures for Disciplining Attorneys." It's something I would commend to you and maybe dust off and see if there have been any actions since this report. I didn't get a satisfactory answer when it was contemporary with a nominee from the Obama administration for the position you're seeking, which is one of the reasons why I opposed the nomination.
Actually, I think very highly of Inspector General Horowitz, and I haven't seen that report, but that issue is one that I plan to take up with him.
And then just so that I do finish on time versus pretend I'm going to and go 2 minutes early over. One, I want to get your recommendation on intellectual property. I think we have more work to do to give the Department of Justice tools to go after bad actors, which are China, Russia, India, a number of other countries, Brazil, that are stealing our intellectual property. Also want to talk about what I think is the exploitation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly around website access. The web didn't exist, and now we have attorneys filing a number of frivolous lawsuits. Would like to get some feedback on that after you get confirmed. And finally, I want to make sure that you recognize in the First Step Act that faith-based organizations that have proven to help reduce recidivism are absolutely in play for the First Step Act, and hopefully we can make sure the Department of Justice move forward with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
I believe that's the end of the first round. Mr. Barr, you're able to go for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay. So